There is a crop that seems to break every rule modern agriculture depends on. It can yield more than potatoes. It can survive the kind of cold that destroys wheat. And once it is planted, it does something almost no industrial crop is allowed to do anymore. It comes back on its own. No yearly seed purchase, no fragile cycle of dependence. It simply returns season after season as if famine itself had once taught the earth how to defend against hunger. For thousands of years, that made it more than food. It made it insurance. In hard seasons, in failed harvests, in landscapes where other crops gave up, this plant remained underground, waiting, ready, reliable, almost impossible to erase. And yet, erase it we did. Not because it failed, not because it was weak, but because it was too successful in the one way the modern world could not tolerate. It fed people without asking permission. It spread without needing to be bought again. It could not be easily controlled, neatly taxed, or endlessly sold. A crop that grows freely, multiplies itself, and keeps feeding people without dependence does not fit comfortably inside systems built on ownership. This is the story of the perennial that survived war, outlasted empires, and still waits beneath the soil. The story opens along the eastern shores of North America in 1605, when the French explorer Samuel de Champlain arrived on the coast of what would later become Massachusetts. There he was welcomed by the Algonquin people with a feast. Among the foods placed before him was a rough, knobby root they called Kaishuk the sun root. Champlain tasted it and compared it to the artichoke of Europe. The flavor impressed him enough that he loaded tubers into the hold of his ship and carried them back across the Atlantic. That plant was what we now call the sunchoke, Helianthus tuberosus, a perennial sunflower native to the Great Lakes region and the eastern woodlands of North America. Long before Europeans ever saw it, Native American communities already understood what made it extraordinary. In some Iroquois traditions, its origin was tied to a sacred story. When Earthwoman died giving birth to her twin sons, Sapling and Flint, the first sunchokes grew from her feet, as if the plant itself had emerged from sacrifice and survival. From the beginning, it was never just another root in the ground. It was food, memory, and inheritance all at once. Above the ground, the plant looks almost ordinary. Tall stalks rising 8 to 10 feet high, crowned with bright yellow flowers that follow the sun like any other sunflower. But what matters is hidden below. Beneath the soil, it forms clusters of knobby tubers, white, purple, sometimes golden, storing energy not as starch, but as inulin. That difference changes everything. Unlike typical crops that depend on replanting seeds year after year, this plant spreads through underground rhizomes. One patch quietly expands beneath the surface, season after season, sending up new growth without ever needing to be planted again. A single planting could feed a village, not just for one harvest, but for generations. It was not just productive, it was self-sustaining. When Lewis and Clark crossed the Dakotas in 1805, their expedition nearly starved. It was Sacagawea who saved them. She found caches of these tubers hidden underground, stores gathered by animals preparing for winter. She dug them out, roasted them over fire, and fed the expedition when nothing else remained. In that moment, the plant proved what native communities had long understood. It was always there, even when everything else failed. The tubers could be eaten raw, crisp like water chestnuts, or boiled until soft. They could be dried and ground into flour that lasted through winter. Even freezing temperatures could not destroy them. They simply waited in the soil, preserved by the cold, ready whenever hunger returned. So if a plant could feed endlessly, survive extremes, and require almost nothing in return, why did the world choose to forget it? What made this plant truly extraordinary was not just its resilience, but its output. The numbers were staggering. A single plant could produce several pounds of tubers, and across a full acre, the yield could reach levels that rivaled or even surpassed the most important staple crops in the world. Centuries later, studies would confirm what early farmers already knew. In cold climates, where wheat struggled and corn required careful conditions, this plant thrived. It could produce around 64,000 pounds per acre without a single drop of irrigation. By comparison, potatoes, one of the most widely relied on crops, reached lower yields even under ideal managed conditions. This was not a luxury crop. It was survival itself. When Champlain carried these tubers back to Europe in the early 1600s, he brought them into a continent that was no stranger to hunger. European soils were exhausted from overuse, and famine returned again and again, cutting through populations with brutal regularity. At that time, even the potato was feared, blamed for disease and mistrusted by many. But this new plant spread quickly. In France, it became known as topinambour. In Italy, girasole, meaning sunflower. It fed peasants, livestock, and even reached the tables of the wealthy. It required almost no care. Plant it once in the spring, harvest in the fall, and if even a fragment remained in the soil, it would return the next year on its own. For a moment, it looked like Europe had found something close to an answer to famine. But that moment did not last. For a time, the plant seemed almost unstoppable in Europe. It arrived when food insecurity was constant, and its advantages were impossible to ignore. It grew easily, demanded little attention, and produced heavily. In a world where failed harvests could mean disaster, that kind of reliability was priceless. University trials centuries later echoed what farmers had already learned through experience. Sunchokes could produce roughly 30,000 calories per acre, while potatoes produced closer to 20,000. In terms of sheer food value, they stood alongside the major staples that shaped civilizations. They were not some minor curiosity. They were a serious source of nourishment. But the same qualities that made the plant powerful in the field made it inconvenient inside the systems Europe was building. The tubers were small, knobby, and irregular. They were harder to clean, harder to sort, and much harder to harvest with efficiency. They spoiled faster than potatoes and could not sit in storage for months waiting to be sold. And for people unaccustomed to the plant, the inulin it contained often caused uncomfortable gas. By the mid-1700s, the balance had shifted. The potato, larger and smoother, easier to store and easier to move through warehouses and markets, fit the structure of European agriculture far better. Tax systems could work with it. Trade systems could scale around it. It matched the logic of control. And that was enough. The sunchoke did not disappear overnight, but it began to fall, slowly reduced from a crop of real value into food for the poor, livestock feed, and a reminder of harder times. In North America, the story followed a similar path. Settlers increasingly favored European crops like wheat and potatoes, crops that fit the agricultural order they already understood, crops that required yearly seed purchases, crops that could be organized, controlled, taxed, and sold within a predictable system. The sunchoke did not cooperate with that logic. It spread too easily. It returned without permission. It survived without much help. What had once made it a safeguard against hunger now made it inconvenient to the kind of farming that was taking shape. So instead of being valued, it was downgraded. In many places, settlers began calling it a weed, not because it was useless, but because it refused to behave like a crop that stayed obediently inside human plans. And so it was pushed aside. It still lived in ditches, along roadsides, and in forgotten corners of fields. But it was no longer treated as something worth cultivating on purpose. It had become a survivor in the margins, present, persistent, but dismissed. So here is the deeper question. If this plant produced so much food, endured harsh climates, and kept returning on its own, why would any system choose to abandon it? The answer would become brutally clear when war arrived, and the world once again learned what this forgotten crop could do when everything else began to fail. The first great reminder came during World War I. Germany was being strangled by the Allied blockade, and food shortages turned into catastrophe. The winter of 1916 became known as the turnip winter, a season so severe that people were forced to eat rutabagas meant for livestock because the potato crop had failed. Hunger spread quickly, and for many, survival came down to whatever could still be found outside the normal food system. That was where the sunchoke returned. Growing wild in neglected fields and forgotten places, it became one of the few foods that could not be easily seized, blockaded, or controlled. It was already there, waiting beneath the ground. People only had to dig. In a time when official supply chains collapsed and ordinary staples disappeared, The plant did what it had always done. It fed those who were desperate enough to remember it. But the lesson would be even harsher during World War II. In France after 1940, Nazi occupation forces seized the vast majority of the country's food. Potatoes were redirected to German soldiers. What remained for ordinary families was whatever the occupiers did not want. Scraps, rutabagas, and sunchokes, vegetables once associated with poverty and animal feed. People ate them day after day, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative was starvation. They were difficult to clean. Their shape made preparation tedious. And when eaten constantly, they caused the same digestive misery people had complained about for centuries. Still, they kept people alive. In the Netherlands, the winter of 1944 became known simply as the Hunger Winter. Food supplies collapsed, transport systems failed, and entire cities were pushed to the edge of starvation. Around 22,000 people died. In response, the government released emergency guides listing anything that could be eaten: wild plants, tulip bulbs, and once again, sunchokes. Families went out into frozen fields with bare hands, digging through hard soil in search of anything edible beneath the surface. The ground itself became the last place to look for survival. And there, just as it had for centuries, the plant was waiting. It did not need to be planted that year. It did not rely on supply chains. It had already prepared itself long before the crisis arrived. But survival came with a cost. After the war ended, many of those who had lived through those years refused to eat sunchokes ever again. In France, in the Netherlands, across occupied regions, the plant became tied to memory, not of resilience, but of suffering. It reminded people of hunger, of occupation, of the worst years of their lives. Entire generations rejected it, not because it failed them, but because it had been there when everything else failed. And so something strange happened. The crop that had saved millions slowly disappeared from markets, from cookbooks, and from everyday life. Not by force, but by memory. So how does a plant go from saving lives to being erased from them? Even as it disappeared from daily life, the plant itself had not changed. Beneath the surface, it still carried the same nutritional power it always had. Every 100 grams provided about 73 calories, along with around 2 grams of protein. It was rich in potassium, roughly 429 milligrams, even more than a banana, along with iron, copper, magnesium, and a range of B vitamins that supported basic cellular function. But its real strength was something most people did not fully understand: inulin. Making up roughly 50 to 60% of the tuber's weight, inulin is one of the richest natural sources of this compound on Earth. Unlike starch, it passes through the stomach undigested and reaches the colon intact, where it becomes food for beneficial bacteria, especially bifidobacteria. As these bacteria feed, they multiply and produce short-chain fatty acids, compounds that lower pH levels in the gut, block harmful pathogens, and improve the body's ability to absorb minerals like calcium and magnesium. Studies would later show that this process helps reduce constipation, strengthens immune function, and may even play a role in preventing certain diseases before they begin. Unlike potatoes, which cause rapid spikes in blood sugar, sunchokes release energy slowly as inulin is converted into fructose. For people managing blood sugar levels, that difference matters. By the 1980s, some diabetics were already writing about eating sunchokes regularly and seeing their insulin needs drop significantly. What had long been part of traditional knowledge was now being confirmed by modern science. So if the plant was this powerful, why was it still missing from the system that claimed to prioritize nutrition? Beyond nutrition, the plant offered something just as important, something modern agriculture has been struggling to recover: the ability to heal the land itself. Unlike annual crops that require constant tilling, this plant is perennial. It does not need the soil to be turned over every season, which means it prevents erosion instead of causing it. Its roots grow deep, breaking apart compacted ground and improving the structure of the soil over time. Where other crops exhaust the land, this one quietly restores it. It also tolerates conditions that would destroy most conventional agriculture: drought, poor soil, and extreme cold. even down to minus 30 degrees Celsius, do not stop it. While other crops fail under stress, this one continues to grow, storing energy underground where heat and dryness cannot easily reach. It was not designed for stability. It was built for chaos. In the 1960s in California, a produce wholesaler named Frida Kaplan noticed something simple but important. The plant was still there, but the name was holding it back. Jerusalem artichoke confused people. It wasn't from Jerusalem, and it wasn't an artichoke, so she gave it a new name, sunchoke. By 1980, she had trademarked it, packaged it, and sold it with recipes. Sales increased dramatically. Chefs began experimenting with it, raw, roasted, turned into soups and purees. For a moment, it looked like the plant might return, but that moment didn't last. In the 1980s, something larger began to form around this plant than just a rebranding. Across parts of the American Midwest, farmers were facing a crisis. Prices were unstable, debts were rising, and many were looking for a way out of dependence on corporate supply chains. The sunchoke seemed to offer exactly that. It could be grown for food, for livestock feed, even for fuel through the fermentation of inulin into ethanol. It required little input, produced high yields, and returned year after year. On paper, it looked like the perfect crop for independence. But the system it needed to survive did not exist. There was no large-scale market ready to buy it, no infrastructure to process it efficiently, no established supply chains to move it at scale. Farmers who tried to adopt it found themselves producing something that worked biologically, but failed economically. And so, once again, the plant was pushed back out of mainstream agriculture. Still, the idea never completely disappeared. In France, decades after the war, chefs began to bring it back under its old name, topinambour, as part of a movement to rediscover forgotten vegetables. What had once symbolized hardship slowly became heritage. By the early 2000s, it started appearing again in farmers' markets across North America and Europe. In permaculture circles, it earned a new reputation, the holy grail of sustainable crops. Plant it once, harvest forever. And yet, despite all of that, it still remained on the margins. So what is really stopping it from returning, not just as a niche food, but as a global staple again? The answer lies in the demands of industrial agriculture itself. Modern food systems do not reward crops simply because they are resilient, nutritious, or generous. They reward uniformity. They reward predictability. They reward anything that can be harvested by machine, packed without damage, stored for months, shipped across great distances, and displayed in perfect rows under supermarket lights. The sunchoke resists all of that. Its tubers do not mature evenly. They vary in size and shape. They cling tightly to the roots, which makes mechanized harvesting inefficient, often leaving a large portion in the ground. They spoil faster than potatoes and do not sit comfortably in warehouses waiting for distribution. Even the thing that makes them nutritionally exceptional, their high inulin content, creates a problem for modern consumers who expect food to deliver comfort instantly. The body needs time to adapt, and industrial food has very little patience for adaptation. That is why the plant remains mostly confined to farmers' markets, specialty growers, and home gardens, where its tendency to spread uncontrollably is seen either as a gift or a nuisance. In some parts of Europe, when it escapes cultivation, it is labeled invasive. But that word reveals something deeper. We often call things invasive when they succeed without permission, when they thrive without needing us, when they expose how little control we truly have. And that may be the real reason this crop was never fully welcomed back. It teaches a lesson systems built on ownership would rather bury. Abundance does not always need control. Some crops do not need annual seed purchases, chemical inputs, or corporate approval. They persist, they adapt, they outlast.